Welcome back to the show. This is Brett, and you are listening to Holistic Health Masterclass podcast. So you will probably notice that I haven't released an episode for the last 3 or 4 weeks. I actually haven't done much over the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's been quite a time of reflection, I will just say. And I'm probably going to record a separate podcast, a solo podcast, which will be very short, just kind of explaining a couple of insights and things that I've gleaned from just taking a bit of a step back over the last 3 or 4 weeks. I think that, in many instances, we focus so much attention outward and we project and speak and talk all the time that we don't really pay attention to what's coming back. And of course, with everything that's going on in the world right now, there's just so much information coming at you, and there's so much dialogue and conversations going on that taking a step back and taking a bit of a time out has actually been quite good. So anyway, I'll record another podcast on that and maybe just share my insights there. On to today's podcast, a podcast that I've actually been working on for probably about 2 or 3 months, and our schedules just didn't line up. To be perfectly honest, I think the first time I actually had Alison booked in, I was a little bit nervous to have her because I didn't quite understand what she was talking about, and so I had to go and do a little bit more reading, a little bit more digging to prepare properly for this podcast interview. I would encourage you just to go and flick through the show notes, have a quick skim through. You'll see exactly what we're talking about. This is a very, very out there kind of episode, but I feel, as you will hear us echo many times on this show, it's important for us to look at this with open eyes, moving forward into this from a place of love. From a place of peace, from a place of that is not fear-driven, right? Because a lot of the stuff that's going on, it doesn't seem to make any sense, okay? And as I've said before on the show, you can go back and listen to the End Game, you can listen to the Sovereignty podcast, you can listen to, many other podcasts here. My focus, yes, we're talking about pandemic, yes, we're talking about virus and all that other stuff, but I've always been concerned with what's coming further down the road, right? And some of the stuff is actually not that far down the road. Some of it's actually happening right now. And so the overarching theme that we're talking about on today's show is really the fourth industrial revolution and technocracy. All right. And there's a lot of other terms that kind of fall underneath that. I kind of opened this episode up by talking about some definitions, right? So what does this stuff mean? What is technocracy? What is transhumanism? What is the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies? Just so that we all kind of get our bearings and we understand what we're actually talking about here before we get into the implications, right? So why did they want to gather all of our data? Why is contact tracing? Why is tracking such an issue? How's our data going to be used? What are the implications of all of that, right? So when you start getting into things like social credit scoring, compliance scoring, rewards, privileges, all that sort of stuff, this stuff is coming down the pipeline, believe it or not. It is coming down the pipeline. And again, I would just encourage you to listen to this podcast with an open mind, first of all. And some of the stuff might be very difficult to wrap your head around, especially if you've never heard of this for the first time. I know that many of you who are regular listeners to the show will really appreciate this because I know that you are dialed into this sort of stuff. I would encourage you to listen all the way to the end because I would say the last third of this, at least from my perspective, really gave me a lot of hope. Right, because I think that it's very easy for us to get wrapped up in fear. Even the activists in us, even the people that have the best of intentions. I find that as we go further down this road, most of us, or a lot of us, are acting from a place of fear because we're genuinely worried about the future. And again, I'll record a separate podcast on that and expand on that. But I think that the last third of this episode made me feel really, really good because the way that we're going to be moving through this and the way for us to get through this and ultimately work our way to a better place is going to be with the power of community, the power of love, and ultimately reconnecting with spirit and the natural world. So I leave that as a message of hope and some positive thoughts as we head into this episode. So please listen to this with an open mind. Share this with your friends, your family, your community. And please welcome to the show, Alison McDowell. All right. Hey, Alison, welcome so much to the show. This is going to be so awesome. I'm delighted to have you here after months of planning and back and forth. How are you today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good. I have so many questions for you. And as I said to you off air, I think that I just want to try and rein us in a little bit today and keep us on some sort of lane, because the stuff that we're going to talk about gets a little bit out there, gets a little bit crazy. But I think that what everyone should realize is that this is not, a lot of the stuff is not happening in the future. It's actually happening right now. And so this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And I'll just sort of preamble a little bit here before I hand the mic over to you. You know, a lot of people, when we think about the pandemic and what's going on right now, you know, a lot of people are still very much fixated on the virus, on the contagion, on getting it under control, on getting the cases down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what myself and people like you have been looking at since the beginning is sort of, well, what's actually going on in the background? Like, there's things that just don't seem to add up. There's decisions that are being made. There's policies that are being put in place. There's solutions in air quotes that just seem to be popping up out of nowhere. You know, one example would be all of a sudden we have a vaccine that magically appeared after a year. We've got these biometric IDs that they're talking about, which all of a sudden just came out of nowhere, again, air quotes. And I think that what the thing that I love about the work that you do is that you have really, I think you're one of the few people on the planet that has actually uncovered, like, you know, 50 steps ahead of looking into the future, right, to see what's actually going on behind the scene. So yeah, welcome again to the show. If you were to try and encapsulate what you do, how would you explain to people in like an elevator pitch, like, what do you research? What do you do?
Well, just by way of context, so I'm based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the U.S., and I sort of characterize myself as a mom and an independent researcher who actually came into all of this through researching public education and school closures. So people in the space come from a lot of different backgrounds, and mine is probably non-traditional, and it wasn't actually founded in health or wellness, but the playbook that they have is very similar across. So if you understand deeply how it applies to managing people as data in education, then you can apply that same structure to what we see happening in the healthcare space. And my background is actually in art history and historic preservation. So my training is sort of looking at primary source materials and then sort of extrapolating and putting together imagery of sort of a bigger picture. It's a synthesis, really, which I think is something that is the kind of thing they're trying to actually move out of the education system. They would prefer us to have very atomized knowledge and bits and pieces, but the inability to actually construct the bigger picture and to project and imagine what the ethical implications are for the things that we're seeing into the future. They want everybody just to stay narrow and focused and in their lane. So I kind of break that down. And my blog, I started out primarily as researching education, and then it moved into managing the poor, because our city is a very poor city. So the nonprofit industrial complex of managing the poor as data, not just children. And then clearly the past year has been expanded to include biological processes, right? And what's advancing with innovations that they frame, but like the coming advent of synthetic biology and genetic engineering and biotech, not simply as something to manage people who have serious health conditions, but really as a global finance opportunity. And so that is my other situation, is understanding the role of data and surveillance within the context of global markets. Global financial markets. So that's sort of my framing, is I map this landscape. That's the thing. When I got my master's in cultural landscape and historic preservation, I never knew that the landscape that I was going to map was a landscape of like automated transhumanism. I did not think that's where it was going, but that's sort of what I do. And I quilt, like, this is my other piece. I haven't done it as much lately, but I do very sort of scrappy quilts. And so that's how I sort of think. I make these maps that put pieces together just the way I make quilts, and I put these pieces together. And then once you sort of step back, you can see the overall scheme.
Yeah. And am I correct in saying that you're also involved with food somehow? Because, there is a holistic side to you as well, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, I work at a public garden, an urban public garden, and I have the benefit of its Lenape land and it's a post-industrial area. We're surrounded by refineries and everything. And so, but I think energetically, there's a very special aspect to the land. We're at on a sand dune that goes down from the Piedmont to the coastal plain of New Jersey. And part of my education experience of really understanding my research focus, which is this social impact investing and data analytics, emerged from I had a mentor who taught me about this, but who was also involved in, he went out with the veterans to Standing Rock. And so part of my clicking of what this actually all was going from like a well-meaning parent to understood things at a very like the NPR listening level to understanding it at a more structural level, was to actually, like, he was there the day of the Standing Rock was raided, and to see Regina Brave, who was a Lakota Navy veteran, standing for her treaty rights, right? As these MRAPs, these militarized MRAPs, came down the hill for this, Indigenous grandmother who was fighting for her legal rights around her land. So to me, that was the space that it crystallized in, is that what we're dealing with is sort of the legacy of a system, as Stephen Newcomb talks about, of domination, a doctrine of domination, that is a colonizing, that both Canada, all of Turtle Island really, are living the repercussions of that. So that's the other layer is how does one relate as we fight for natural life against synthetic biology to stand in that history and try to heal that piece as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, and I think we'll probably circle back to a bit of that a little bit later on in our talk today. A couple of other things that I'll just throw out there and longtime listeners to the show, you would have heard me speak about this before. Things like the fourth industrial revolution, like the technocracy and the tech takeover by these big tech companies, the World Economic Forum agenda and that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to sort of throw that out there for our listeners and people watching this broadcast. Just so you know that there's a rough framing around all of that, and we're going to kind of unpack some of that today. So I wanted to just start off ground zero, and let's just get some fundamentals out the way for people who are maybe not familiar with some of these terms. I think let's just start off with a simple one. How would you define technocracy? Like, what is technocracy to you?
So I think, technocracy, Patrick Wood is someone who's done a lot of historical research about it. I mean, at a fundamental level, it's about an industrially engineered society. And these ideas go back to Thorstein Veblen back in the 1890s and were sort of lifted up in the 1930s in the United States out of the Columbia University School of Industrial Engineering. So looking at life on planet Earth as an industrial problem to be managed for efficiency. And in Philadelphia, Friedrich Taylor, like Taylorism, this idea of social efficiency, automation, assembly lines, how does one handle life in the most efficient way possible for productivity, for sort of profitable gain. And now we're looking at the extension of this into really Microsoft and many of these powerful interests really using bioinformatics and genomics to put us in a planetary computer, like a digital simulation. So it's that extension. I would say, the challenging thing with technocracy is that a lot of people have different framings for what's going on. And technocracy is one. Some people say communitarianism. Some people say fascism. Some people say communism or social. Like everybody has the slice. And so I would say the piece that resonates with me is John Trudell talking about a predator energy. Like there's this dominating force that is increasingly mechanical, a mechanized force of channeling a natural, like sort of the beautiful chaos of natural life into a more regimented, systematic process, which again comes out of the late 19th century social engineering, but through cybernetics and then forward. And
then, of course, just to add on to that, we would be looking at sort of now micromanaging a lot of that data using technology, right? So if we go back, maybe 40 or 50 years, we didn't have things like AI artificial intelligence. We didn't have the technology and the quantum computing power and all of this other stuff, and we also didn't actually have the data, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that, because data is really central to our discussion today. So actually having the data and then having the computation power and the tracking ability to actually use that data now and micro funnel it, if you want, down different channels and different pathways, right? So, and of course, to do all of this stuff, we, let's just segue into the next piece, which is, I would love to know what a blockchain actually is, because I know you talk a lot about blockchains and, we look at the crypto market right now. So cryptocurrencies are huge. And I think, a lot of people will understand that cryptocurrency is all managed on a blockchain, but no one really knows what a blockchain actually is. So maybe you can help us out with that.
Right. So in its essence, blockchain technology is a digital ledger system. So if you understand the history of accounting, right, and developments in accounting, that, like I say, that the maritime trading rode on Europe's adoption of double entry bookkeeping, right? Because you would track costs and income across time and space, and that was needed to do this global trade, a lot of which was also based on trade of enslaved people, right? Enslaved Africans and that sort of thing. So the accounting system has this deep history. So then the next level of accounting is to be able to track assets into virtual worlds, really.
Okay.
And I think people who might be familiar with gaming platforms, which I'm not a deep gamer, but understanding digital items that you might acquire either through point systems or acquisition systems in digital economies. Blockchain is something that is used to track a digital asset. And so it's not simply just currency, the way we might understand crypto, but it is actually tracking all sorts of assets. And these assets could also be like a right or a privilege that would be turned into a token.
Okay.
So the difference of this kind of ledger, one is tracks things digitally. The second is that this is what everyone says is so wonderful. It's decentralized, right? So it's supposedly unhackable because the data is stored in many different places and you can't crack them all at the same time. Realistically, there are often side chains and bits and pieces and wallets that can be hacked. So in and of itself, it's not completely accurate to say it's unhackable, but it's this idea of a permanent record. Your permanent record, it's going on your permanent record. The other piece is that data is locked in place, is the permanency through cryptography. So that is what the Bitcoin comes in, is that in order to lock in data into the blockchain, there are these cryptographic puzzles that computers compete to do. And back in the early days, which were, in 2008-ish, when in the aftermath of the last global financial crash, this just shows up on the scene, this anonymous Satoshi Nakamoto shows up, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
And people would set up computers in their garages and mine crypto for money. Well, now with the quantum computing, that playing field is gone. That phase of DIY crypto mining in your, garage is over. It's a very intensive process, a lot of which is actually based in China. There's a lot of stuff based in hydro. It's very energy intensive.
I've heard that.
So there's that piece. It's digital, it's decentralized, it's cryptographic, and it's assets, and it's assets far beyond simply currency. It is these rights and privileges, because what's going to happen, and maybe we'll talk about that in a bit, is this idea of a spatial web, is that your interactions with smart systems, which would be smart appliances, smart cars, smart streetlights, smart environments, will be tracked then on blockchain at this very, very granular level data. So you might have something big like a birth certificate on blockchain, but it also might be I paid for my on-street parking on this day at this time for this many hours. So it could be something as big as a birth certificate or as small as how long you parked on the street downtown. And
so these would essentially then be considered assets, right? So these are mini assets, little data sets. And of course now when you can imagine, as we start tracking all of this stuff, once you start putting it together, you now have the ability to track large swaths of group-based or population-based data as well as the individual, right? But we're going to come back to something a little bit later, because I think a lot of this ties into social credit scoring, right? So basically, based on your behavior, and I know that this is something we're going to spend a good bit of time on, based on your behavior, you essentially generate these assets, right? So I paid for my parking, I ate this type of food, I posted this on social media, blah, 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 blah. And then based on all of that, you have these outcomes, rewards, and essentially the gamification of society, right? So let's come back to that in a minute. A couple of foundational things again, and I think this is all segueing into one another, which is great, is what is the Internet of Things? How would you explain that?
Yeah. So we're sort of at tiptoeing into this next phase of the internet. And they call it Web 3.0 or the spatial web. And so in this, the internet actually comes out of the devices, like out of a screen-based device, which we're used to interacting with, whether that's on a laptop or on a smartphone or on, a wearable technology like a Apple Watch or something like that. And it leaves the screen, and it actually, these small, very small sensors, which are part of this, they create this Internet of Things network, go out into the world, both like in your house and potentially in your body, and then also in the world. And they're all like connected like this web system. And so they've gotten to the point, if you look up like, I remember when I was first doing this education stuff and I stumbled across like DARPA's neural dust, and they're talking about like neural dust and brain, floating it into your brain. And I'm thinking, is this real?
I know, it's like sci-fi craziness.
It's not like you don't need a FOIA request, right? You just Google DARPA neural dust and and this is like 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm thinking, oh, wow. So now they're talking about sensors in paint, right? Everything is smart. It's the smart, sensors in pavement, sensors in street lamps. Like in Philadelphia, our first smart things were these really stupid big belly trash cans, which seems like kind of an odd thing, like to have a smart trash can, but evidently it was supposed to report back like, I'm full, come get me. So it would be very efficient for the trash, the collection. But I don't think Philly ever actually plugged that part in.
Okay.
But so they create this apparatus in which I sort of frame it, it's almost like we're living in an augmented reality video game. And right now, probably the key Internet of Things sensor that people would imagine would be their smartphone. That's their sort of their minding tracking device.
Yeah. So, which is, I just want to sidestep for a minute here. Because I think what a lot of people are going to start to ask themselves now as we get further into this conversation, the example that you used is a smart trash can, right? But we might also be reporting back or sensing good data, right? So a lot of these things in terms of the way they're framed, the language that's being used, et cetera, it all looks like it's amazing, right? These are things that we should strive for. We want to track and measure all of these data points so that we can have a better world, right? We can have a more sustainable future. We can have the perfect human being with the perfect health, et cetera. And when you start getting into things like World Economic Forum language, when you start getting into politically correct language, woke language, and that sort of thing, that's something I've also touched on briefly on the show. That is the exact same language that is being used here for everything that we're talking about, right? For Internet of Things, data tracking, et cetera. So I don't know if you want to share any thoughts with us on that, because it ties in a lot with what we're talking about right now.
Yeah. Well, so on the one hand, I will say the Internet of Things runs on these next generation telecommunication systems. So we have the 5G technology, which is incredibly intensive because they don't radiate very well. So you have to have them like every 1,500
everywhere,
feet.
Yeah.
I have them on either end of my block right now. And they won't do the research to actually unpack what the health implications are for all of natural life, not just people, but like invertebrates. There's indications that the microwaves are, baking the exoskeletons of the pollinators, like all sorts of really dark things.
Yeah.
But no one will look into that because the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of Things will run on these telecom things. So no one is allowed to question what the long-term implications are, because this transformation into a digital world is so strongly coming with all of these interests. So when we say that it's sustainable, it's how they frame the discussion. So we won't talk about the health implications of the technologies, both the small cell technology. We know there's 6G coming, which is robot to robot communication. We're not going to talk about where the minerals come from for all these sensors. We're not going to talk about the e-waste. We're not going to talk about the child miners in Congo, or the countries that we advanced coups on their governments. So we're not going to talk about the land defenders in Latin America who are trying to protect their land from the mining interests. And I know for Canada, that's a huge, I didn't fully appreciate the extent to which Canadian interests were involved in global mining enterprises.
Yeah, big time.
So that's a huge thing, right? And it's a colonial project. So we're going to say it's about sustainability. And all of these key elements that are really central to the conversation are now off the table. We're not going to talk about removing indigenous communities from land so that we can protect them, right? So I would say when I came into this, I was understanding that it was all tied to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Which again, we're trained to believe, the UN, what could possibly be wrong? UNICEF, they're a problem. But what essentially the United Nations has melded with the World Economic Forum, with the largest and most powerful interests in the world, many of which are defense interests and debt finance interests.
And pharmaceutical interests.
And chemicals,
yeah.
Right? They're things that are not good for life. And then I would say 2/3 of the 17 goals are about managing the poor. They're about managing people in poverty. And then there's a third that are about water and air and sustainable, but it's about managing the poor in smart cities, moving people off of the land into cities, which, and again, if you look at the narrative around the Green New Deal and climate justice, it's largely been hijacked by corporate interests. And that's something that, Cory Morningstar, who is based in Canada, and Wrong Kind of Green, and Clive Spash are all very, very good at the environmental piece. And I brought in the human piece and the poverty piece. So the question is, if we have a green climate justice movement that isn't talking about militarism, right?
Yeah.
It isn't talking about war, it kind of becomes if we all just use paper straws, it would be fine. And I'm actually not. We have to interrogate global supply chains. When we're talking about petrochemical industries and biotech and all of these, the blockchain is used for supply chain tracking. There are many aspects to this that we actually have to reimagine how we live in the world and what our relationship is to one another, and the impacts of the global north on the global south, and all of these larger questions. The plan is, through the Sustainable Development Goals, to target vulnerable communities, particularly a lot of this is going through humanitarian aid, to be responsible for fixing the problem that they didn't actually create. And in behaving properly according to set behaviors that are determined by global corporate interests, that they will run these new social impact markets and create new forms of revenue under the guise of humanitarianism, which is wrong. It's actually totally an outright bald-faced lie, but no one's willing to actually dig into the structure and then link it to the history of domination and colonization and all of these things that we've been doing forever.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me, just to kind of pull all that together, it seems to me like we're on the front end marketing looks amazing, right? I mean, it's oh my gosh, we're saving the planet. Everyone's going to be changing their diet, so their diet is better. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So we're changing the diet, we're changing the way we grow food, we're changing all of the stuff, and it's all going to be amazing. But on the back end of it all, we're not seeing the more nefarious agendas, if you will, that are driving all of these things. So I think that's
local food is going to be a cargo container of microgreens in the Walmart parking lot.
Literally. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, a show here on holistic health, there's a few things we're going to focus on today, and food is one of them, because so we'll get there in a second. Yeah. You mentioned something here. I guess let's just talk about transhumanism for a minute, because before we get into some of the nitty gritty here, how would you explain transhumanism to people out there?
Yeah, it's crazy that we even have to talk about this.
I know.
I mean,
It's crazy that we have to talk about a lot of stuff we're going to talk about today, but you know what? We have to have these conversations.
But
We
like,
have to
if
have
you
these
actually,
conversations.
and I want to say, the when we look back to the history of like industrial engineering, electrical engineering, like there's a lot of things that they've had their eyes on for some time that they have not yet accomplished. Mm-hmm. So I just want to frame for your audience that the things I'm talking about are things that are advanced by very powerful interests, but it doesn't mean that it's all predestined that it will all happen or happen in the time frame that they identify. So I don't want to be just fatalist about this. I think some people imagine that I'm not, but I think we actually have to look at it and reckon with it. We can't just, look the other way and pretend that it'll all be fine, that it'll probably not happen, because I think those of us who can look at it do have to look at it. So, when I got into the education space, what I realized was their goal was interoperable data systems, and collecting all sorts of information on children, both their cognitive information, their mental health information, all of this stuff in one electronic record. And then what I realized over the past year and a half is that really all of that interoperable data that's coming through the Internet of Things, through the Internet of Bodies, with the 5G, hanging on your blockchain identity that they're going to set up for you, is that they aim to make digital twins.
Okay.
So if you imagine that this is an economic, the underpinnings of this are about power and economics, and the capitalist framing requires growth. Like, you can't continue to have capitalism unless you have growth.
Right.
And so then the question becomes, in a world of finite resources and incredible concentrations of wealth and power, how does growth continue to happen if the masses become dispossessed and have debt and cannot grow the economy through normal consumer culture that we've had for a century or more, at least, in the global north? What does that look like? What does growth look like then? And also, we're hitting up against the limits of the world. Like, I mean, I'm not someone who says that we're not harming the planet. Like, clearly there is incredible harm being done.
Absolutely, yeah.
It is the nature of how we address that harm and the strategies and that is what I question, right? So we've got these issues: poor people, a harmed environment, less and less resources, and yet an imperative to grow. And so my conjecture, and I'm happy to hear other people's ideas about it, but that actually the plan is to build a parallel universe that is virtual. And that is where the growth will continue to happen. And not that will involve no material resources, because clearly there will still be energy requirements in the data centers and the e-way, all of the things we've talked about, but it will be different. So, you can consume many more digital items if you live as an avatar, a cartoon avatar in a digital universe. And maybe you can actually be multiple avatar characters, and all of those can be mined for data and managed as a growth enterprise for this new imagining of capital in a video game world, which is fundamentally military. Most people are not necessarily aware that the simulation, that these augmented virtual reality worlds, the gaming worlds, come out of military research and development, largely with Disney, right? The Army Research Lab and Disney create, synthetic people. And that is my sense, is that is inverting, and it's going in so that they can continue this growth in a way without having to fundamentally change this sort of warlike, toxic behavior that we've been pursuing for so long. So transhumanism is both two things. On the one hand, it is becoming, this avatar is becoming a digital version of yourself. And that's a transhumanist element. The other element is that, the Elon Musks of the world, he's fronting for many other interests. I mean, if you look at Hanson Robotics and Ben Goertzel, this idea of creating cyborg, where the human merges with the machine.
Right.
And whether that, and, clearly we've already got that to a certain extent. People have pacemakers, people have, prosthetics, people have these other things, but really taking this to a new level. And to the extent that it may not even be visible, that some of that cybernetic element, the electrical engineering control systems may come through nanotechnology.
Right.
And that is something that has been going on for 20 years with really, I mean, if you work in those worlds, I mean, it's clear I mean, the academic papers, the research journals, the conferences, if you care to go looking for it, it is all laid out.
It's all there, yeah.
But it's not in the general public awareness that is happening. Mm-hmm. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we use electrical engineering systems, nanorobotic systems, not just to cure cancer, not just to like help people who have neurological problems, but like at a population level, because a lot of what is coming is actually built on a history of eugenics.
Yeah.
And so if we imagine that the future is one where those in power prefer us to live as an avatar, in my sense is, what does eugenics look like, right? It isn't strong, healthy people. It is sort of people who have all sorts of frailties and chronic illness to be managed, who would prefer to spend their consciousness inhabiting a virtual body than their actual body. And so this transhumanism, it takes on these two pieces. One is through environmental toxicity or population level bioengineering to remake people as cybernetic creatures. And then two, to harvest your data such that you actually are creating a parallel avatar of yourself in a virtual world.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, when you do think of nanoparticle technology, nanorobotics and stuff like that, go and look it up on the internet. I mean, we have nanodust. Nanodust is like smaller than a grain of rice. So this technology exists. And of course, how do you get it into your body? Well, you could breathe it in through the environment. It could be administered through an injection, so a lot of people are talking about this, the whole microchipping and Bill Gates and whatever else, which on the surface sounds completely insane. I mean, it sounds like a dark sci-fi movie of some kind. But I think that when you actually boil it down and you do look at it honestly with an open mind, it's not that far-fetched. We have the technology to be able to do this. And then again, if we have these nanorobotics inside of us and that interfaces with the 5G, with the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, now all of a sudden we've got this one-way communication. I'm not sure if it's two-way, but essentially the harvesting of data, as you said. So
biosensors. Yeah, I would encourage people to just look up graphene biosensors. And it's very difficult because people say, well, show it to me. And I mean, you could show them all the papers, but I don't have an electron microscope. I can't in that way, having this sort of public health ongoing crisis that is based in something that you can't actually deal with unless you have expertise in electron microscopy is it's very sneaky, right? Because it's only the people who have access to these such technologies who can be the authorities, right? Because regular people don't have access to those technologies to present an alternate opinion, or those who do are silenced. So it's quite brilliant how they've laid it out. And I would just say, if people have questions, there's something called the Japan Science and Technology Agency, which is the government of Japan, and SoftBank, which is the world's largest AI and robotics innovation fund. Finance is in Japan, and Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, which is doing digital twinning, and 6G is in Japan. They've said their moonshot project goal 1 is that by 2050, we will live without the need of a physical body and mind in time and space.
Crazy.
So they're already conjecturing these. I mean, you can just look up the Japan Science and Technology Agency Moonshot Project Goal 1. There are quite a few papers on it. You should look up the Internet of Bio-Nano Things, Ian Achildes at Georgia Tech, and just look at what they're doing, because at this point, no one is reining in the scientists, which are all coming really from this militarized background, to say, just because you can do it, should you, given the current wealth and power imbalances in the world? Should we trust you that your intentions are good, or that we want to live a life in this way? And if you did, well, you should leave room for the rest of us to not have to live that way. But most of what's happening with the nanoparticulates is going to be happening through geoengineering. So it's not like you can carve out a small part of the world and say, off limits, I know in Rhode Island, I actually have a friend who's working on legislation at the state level to fine nanoparticulates, coming in the air over the state of Rhode Island, which would have a huge repercussion because it's a little state and it will like bump up against a bunch of other states. But no one's even very few people even know to talk about that or raise those concerns.
So, and obviously, I mean, look, this is a health and wellness podcast. So I'm sure that just like I'll put it bluntly, we're all trying to live as natural a life as possible. We're trying to eat organic food. We're trying to, do the best we can in the world, with the best of intentions, look after our children, our families, etc. So what we're talking about here is a complete 180, where again, on the surface, we might look at some of these things and say, it would be good to track my blood sugar and have an incentive to get better. But what we're not looking at is the back end of it all. And I think that segues into my next question. A lot of people will ask, what's the point? We hear about contact tracing, we hear about tracking, and you'll get, of course, the detractors, which will just simply say, well, they're already tracking you through your phone. What's the big deal here? And I think that what people need to understand is what is the ultimate purpose of tracking all of this data, and what are they intending to do with all of our data? And that's where you kind of bring in the hedge fund managers and the Goldman Sachses of the world and whatever. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit to just help our audience understand what the whole point is of collecting and using all of this data.
Yeah. Well, so I would say my realization over the past 3 or 4 months has really been, I think the end game is the transhumanism part. Like, I think in some ways, this idea of the matrix really isn't that far off. And Sophia Smallstrom has done a lot of work around piezoelectric human energy harvest. And like, maybe some of this is about us powering the planetary computer, that because these people who are running this game have more money than they could ever need or spend.
Yeah.
And so I think on the one hand, it is about further concentrating wealth and power. But it's also something bigger. It is, I think, these people want to imagine themselves to be gods, and I don't know what sort of derangement happens that would lead someone to feel that they could be in control of not just human life, but all of natural life on the planet down to the microbiome. But I think that is sort of this idea that stems, again, I just link it back to this long legacy of domination that Stephen talks about. But so in the meantime, so this is where I started out before the past year, was that, okay, a core element that most people were not talking about was the Internet of Things, which we've talked about, and tracking people in these smart environments, because Philadelphia is a smart city, to fuel the next version of speculative financial markets, essentially to frame human beings as the next debt instruments. And so if we look at the timeline of the last global economic crash that was around housing and real estate, in the 12, 13 years since that time, the wealth has only become more concentrated. Mm-hmm. And the reason that happened was that there were these vast pools of money that had to be put somewhere, because the other element of capitalism is it has to circulate. Capital has to stay in motion, or the entire Ponzi scheme will fall apart. And that's why even after the last crash, they said, everybody go out and keep spending money, right? Because if everybody else stopped, the whole machine would fall apart and the wheels fall off. So now we're at a point where many people never recovered their housing stability, the gig economy, globalization continues, and the heroin epidemics. There are many things. And so what is the next big thing, right? What is the next big short? Well, we have even more capital. Where do we put it? And so what has been built up is essentially framing human beings as debt instruments. And that has been enabled through a combination of factors. One of which is the blockchain technology systems that will track you and be used to predictively profile your behaviors. And MIT is a key, Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston is key in this, and they've actually built a back end for blockchain called Enigma protocol that allows them to query on encrypted data. So it's sold as private. And I think that's what they want all of us to embrace their solution as a privacy solution. But they don't realize that the back end, even if it's private, they can still use this data to run these impact markets. So that means that you'll still never get a real doctor. You'll still never have a real teacher. Robots are going to be taking care of your elderly parents because it all has to run through the blockchain. So even if you have it private, it's still a sucky situation. So they needed the digital identity. They need the spatial web tracking, and they need the predictive profiling. And then the last bit of this is something that actually dates back to the mid 1990s. And it's a premise called outcomes-based government contracts, which sounds great. And because on the one hand, like I live in a city, my city has been run by Democrats for forever. It's still really, really super corrupt and really, really poor. And so it's not so much a partisan issue because all of the sides are in on this, globally. All power is in on this. And they give you different brands to pit you against each other. But the people in power know that this is the game. And so they'll say, well, if we're going to do, we don't have much money because the rich don't pay many taxes and the poor don't have any money. But the governments will pay for public services, whether that's education, healthcare, housing, food assistance, if it works. And this is something that was advanced by Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, ambassador to the UN, ambassador to the World Health Organization. He's going to run the global police state. And he's like, well, we'll pay if it works. And he's trained people through Harvard Kennedy School all over North America, Europe, and India on this what works government. And that all runs on data analytics. So that actually started in the late 90s with Arthur Rolnick, who is an economist at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. So this is all tied with the central banking systems. And so part of this is it's you as a debt commodity, and it's almost like people who are familiar with the sovereignty movement, this idea of the straw man, betting on, it's like they've just brought the straw man out and said, here's your digital twin, right? Like we're going to start betting on your digital twin and predictably profiling your social credit system. And it's almost pre-crime. So they're mostly betting on children because in this thing, it's like, I'm sorry, it's a bit hard to explain. So you're framed as a debt instrument. You're tied to your digital identity. Now this digital identity is also connected to electronic government, which I know Canada is very central in advancing both digital ID and e-government now. You are one of the 9 or 10 now digital nations, the pioneers in digital government, okay? Once you are set as an e-citizen in relation to the state, you then start to, it's like the technocracy. What have we spent on you? How much money have we put into you by the government? And what is your output? What is your economic return? Only it's not going to be the government. It's going to be private investors. And they will be investing through these pay for success deals, which will be securitized. And then they'll decide the return on investments based on your behaviors. And if you're going along, and that behavior will be tracked in the spatial web, with the sensor network, with your phone, with your Fitbit, with your biosensor. And that's how they will track their return on their investment in you as a digital citizen.
So would you say that a lot of this has to do, I mean, what I'm hearing is like there's, and I'll kind of tie this together in a minute, there's like the social credit scoring / compliance side of things, right? So we want to make sure, and of course we've heard this a lot here, a lot of people, I mean, we're still in lockdown right now at time of recording. It just got extended again. It just keeps getting extended. State of emergency keeps getting extended, regardless of cases, regardless of anything else, right? But we also have a biometric ID here in Ontario that is being piloted now. It's coming out. They've got QR codes that are happening in Quebec now. So the digitization of all of these things are happening right now. It's not something that's happening in the future, right? But I wanted to just to kind of pull some things together for our audience, because I think a real world example would probably help, right? So let's just say you've got, and we'll talk about children for a minute, because I know that's kind of how you entered into this whole line of research. So let's say you have a kid and that kid gets put onto the blockchain from the time they're born, right? So just like a birth certificate. But now we're measuring all of these different data points, right? So as they grow up, we might be measuring their mental health. We might be measuring their social skills. We might be measuring their weight, what they eat, their poop. We can measure all of this stuff, right? And I just, before I carry on, I just want people to understand here that, again, this stuff is happening right now. So if we're talking about vaccine passports, right? Vaccine passports are a big deal now. There's a lot of countries that are talking about them. And of course, on the surface, people are just saying, well, it's just to show that you have COVID-19 vaccine status, and people go, well, you need a vaccine to go to Africa, you need to be vaccinated against malaria or typhoid or whatever the case may be. You need these things anyway, so what's the big deal? Why is a passport such a big deal, right? And I think if you look at it on the surface, it seems pretty benign, right? Like, okay, so if I don't want to get a vaccine, well, then it's a problem, right? But for those people who want to get vaccines, you get your vaccine, you get your passport, and off you go, and life goes back to normal, air quotes. Well, I just want to update people, and I'm going to read this verbatim here because the UK and the NHS, they actually have a vaccine passport. They've got an app, right? That initially it said, oh, well, we're just going to use it for external travel, right? So inter-country travel. And now they're talking about it, well, we're probably going to use this internally as well. And the recent update on their app, basically, they've now included special category data. Okay, so COVID-19 vaccine status is one thing, but the special category data includes physical and mental health. It includes information on family and relatives. It includes lifestyle and social behavior, ethnicity, genetic information, criminal convictions or alleged criminal behavior, and essentially access to all of your medical data since you were born. This is happening right now. This is, forget about the blockchain, forget about anything else. This is happening right now. So the reason why I bring all of this up is because as we're starting to track all of this data, to your point, we now can have outcomes, right? Yeah. So we can now say, okay, he's a good student. He's doing this, he's doing that. We can reward people. And the reward is maybe not going to be monetary. The reward might be privileges, right? So that's social credit. Yeah. So that's social credit scoring. If you're a good boy, you behave, you do your thing, then you get a seat at the VIP table, whereas someone else doesn't even get to enter the restaurant, right? Am I on the right track with this line of thinking here for now?
Yeah. I mean, it is that engineering system. And then it's also the predicting. So like these investors will make bets on it. And what I want to point out is that what happened with the housing market crash was that the people who really made out were the people who shorted the market.
Yeah.
Right. There's the film, The Big Short, and it's actually a very useful film to watch to understand that if you replace toddlers, people in addiction, unhoused people with the mortgages bundled as tranches of investment, that's what it is coming to. And so on the one hand, someone might be betting that you behave. And then on the other hand, there might be other people betting that you don't behave.
Wow.
And then in this mix, you have a smart environment with factors that change up that might make it more or less likely that you accomplish the goal that someone has been given to you, right? Because a lot of this won't be you making your own way. It will be someone assigns you a set of tasks that you have to do. And then the smart environment may make it smooth your way to get those tasks done, or may throw up obstacles in every single step. And then increasingly, eventually that may be tied in with artificial intelligence. So it's not even people, right? Like have terrible luck with the bus. Just even before all of this, like my family, they come like 5 minutes, the bus comes and we go. If I'm waiting by myself, it's always 25-minute wait for the bus. So imagine if you've got a portfolio and someone like the satellite eye in the sky is looking down and going, John Doe down there, they've got a pretty big bet he's not making it to his workforce placement today, and then the bus gets detoured. So, I mean, it's kind of silly to think about, but if we're turning the planet, if the goal of these people is to turn the planet into a machine, do we really think that these people who would be sociopathic enough to imagine themselves to be gods would necessarily run the planetary computer to make everyone happy? They're not running the planetary. It's a military project. The military project is not running the planetary computer to make everyone happy and well-adjusted and have their needs met. It's just not.
Well, because I think something else I've heard you say and I've read is these outcomes, were essentially what's the correct way to frame this? You have to you can't have people achieve the best outcomes because that's not actually the most useful, right? We want to have them constantly in a state of poverty. We want them in a constant deficit state, trying to get out essentially, and then that's better for the.
And you never get out. As soon as you get to the end line, it's kind of like being in the line at Disney. and you're like, wait, and you queue through and you think you're almost to the ride, and then you get in the next room and there's like a whole other set of, I mean, that's what it is, because if they actually solved the problems, there would be no market for their investment and the whole thing would fall apart.
Well, and I think it's useful for people to also look at this in the context of what is going on now with the so-called pandemic, right? Again, we're in Ontario here, and I would say the whole of Canada. I mean, people are kind of are appalled at what is happening in Canada right now, and you have to wonder to yourself, based on, if you look at the case numbers, if you look at hospitalization rates, blah blah blah, all of this stuff. I mean, we are not, by any stretch of the imagination, we are not another Brazil. We are not a country where people are dropping dead in the street, where we've seen mass fatalities or anything like that. Relatively speaking, we still have an IFR of, whatever it is, 0.26%, and so on and so on. So the question always has to be then, like, if you are constantly shuttering businesses, if you're pushing people further into poverty, if you're not giving them a means to make an income for themselves, and now they've already approved universal basic income, right? So
that's the thing. Like, so that's the starter money for the game. I mean, I sort of frame this as, if you're like, imagine again, if you're like a gamer, you're in a virtual world, and then you interact some with like these non-playable characters, or like they're run by algorithms, and you have agency in the game. Like, you're making your way through the game on your quest. It's almost like over time, you're becoming a non-playable character. Like, you're losing any agency over your own decisions, and you're being put on pathways in ways that you can't just pursue your own future. You actually have to just do what the algorithm says to do, or you'll get shut down. And then if you do obey all the things, then you can level up to the next task and maybe acquire some new digital items. But like, really, this idea is to roboticize masses of people. So like, how does this work? If everyone had nothing, they would rebel. They would be in the streets, right? If everyone was like literally being starved to death, they would find common cause and do something about it. But the UBI is I think sort of the way to let off a little steam, right? We'll string people along. I don't know what it is in Canada. Here,
it's 2,000 a month.
We get 1,000. You can't live on $1,000 US dollars a month. No. You can't.
No, like, same here.
So my sense is that ultimately the goal will be that you will sell your data, and that your data will be private, but you'll build a brand, and then you can, and we've even seen that with BitClout and some of these ideas of people betting on people's personalities and social scoring. Like, you could say it will be the new plasma bank, right? Well, we'll dribble you along a little money so you don't die. But if you want any extra, if your kid breaks their arm or whatever, you're going to have to sell off some data to pay this out. And part of the UBI is it's being framed as like, no strings attached. Here, we'll just give you money however you want to use it. And that's disingenuous, because the plan is not for it to be that. It will be blockchained, and it will have all sorts of strings attached. And then ultimately it will be outsourced to private investors. And that's where the libertarians come in. Because I try to like bring the people together and say, libertarians, like, you guys might think you're going to be great with your blockchain and all, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, get the government out of your life and live on blockchain. Well, I'm saying, because the faith communities are part of a lot of this, I'm like, if you're a faith community, you're investing in people. Are you going to really track people's social credit scoring and put religion on blockchain and track people's behavior in order for them to survive? Is that charitable? Yeah. Is that a charitable practice? Because that's how it's going to go. So on the one hand, the libertarian people think it's going to be great. And I'm like, well, what really are your ethics? Because it's going to be the Peter Thiels of the world making the investments. It's not like you're going to have your own little small town with your own local crypto economy. It's not going to be that, and unless you fight for it, but they don't even know that what the end game is. So they can't even fight for it. And on the other hand, people are embracing on the left saying, well, the government should do this for us. Which, people have needs met, but this is being manufactured on purpose so people lose all agency. Well, so both sides are not getting it.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key point, is it is being manufactured. Do you know, like we could just open everything up right now and let people carry on with their lives, but why are we not? And then of course you double
build the virtual world, for goodness sakes, and sit in their closet and code it.
Yeah, and the other thing the last thing I want to say on UBI that a lot of people are not getting is, again, when everything is blockchain, now they're talking about digital currencies, right? So forget about crypto like Bitcoin and Ethereum and whatever. Now it's like, well, the Canadian dollar becomes digitized all of a sudden. The US dollar is digitized and there's no more paper money or anything. Well, guess what? Every single thing is then tracked and traced, and there's no more, hey, here's $10 to the kid to cut my grass on a Saturday morning. That's not going to happen anymore. There's no selling off my old stroller that I had for my kid for $100. Like, that's not going to happen anymore because everything is tracked and traced. The second thing I'll say with UBI that a lot of people don't understand is there's a high likelihood that as this becomes digitized, you're not going to be able to accrue any wealth. So on the first of the month, you get your $2,000. There you go. Do whatever you need with it. You can't survive on it anyway. But at the end of the month, if you didn't spend a penny, it gets wiped clean and you get another $2,000, right? So there's never going to be that ability to acquire and accumulate any wealth. And something I've said on the show before is, in Canada particularly, we have racked up so much debt over the course of the last 15 months. Justin Trudeau has literally racked up more debt than all of the other prime ministers ever in the history of Canada combined, which is astounding. And if you think about how that debt has to be paid back, if there's no production and there's no economic output, there's no manufacturing of goods, there's no jobs. Well, there's seizure of assets is one. So, here's your $2,000 a month, but you can't pay your mortgage. We'll own your house. You live in your house, and same thing with your car and everything else. And the second way to do that is obviously, as you're saying, is going to be through the acquisition of your data. Right. So biological data, which again, relative to what I was saying in the UK and the NHS vaccine passports,
Maybe he's looking to get into human mining. I mean, that's really, I think you think of the extension of it. Canada's such a big mining economy, right? They're just mining a different resource.
Yeah. I want to shift. Yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk to you about health. And that side of things, right? So actual human health, because a lot of the stuff now, we talk about things like genomics, right? So nutrigenomics and genomics has become like a real hot button topic these days. As someone who practices, and this is maybe where you and I might butt heads a little bit, I don't know. We talk a lot about personalized care, and personalized health programs, personalized protocols. I've worked with nutrigenomics and I've worked with genomic testing in a clinical setting. Obviously, I'm doing it as one person based on your symptoms, your lifestyle, everything else, with the intention of improving your health, right? That's what my goal is, obviously. But so when you look at it through that lens, I think a lot of people on the surface are going to go, well, we can have personalized supplements. I can run a DNA test and have a personalized diet and all of this cool stuff, right? I can map out my own human microbiome. And all of these things sound amazing, right? Because if I had that information in my hand and that information was for me only, and I was doing something with that information for my personal health, I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. But the way that you've been speaking about it makes it look very, very different. So perhaps you can kind of explain to us what is going on behind the scenes with all of that.
Well, so United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 3 is health. And, the one thing I want to sort of frame within like the health and wellness community, and I've said this like with Sergi, we've had some conversations, is that like the wellness communities have to, I think, also grapple with, especially if people are familiar with like the terrain framing, right? Is that like you can do all the healthy behaviors you want, but if you live in a fully toxic environment, that's only going to get you so far. And so I think that like we have to, especially as I think people become more and more emotional about what's happening and upset and frustrated, that those of us who are looking at the picture more holistically don't turn into the thing that we're fighting, right? Because I think there is like a judgmental aspect to this. Yep. And it's easy to feed into, we're all human, right? Like that's the beauty. We're human, we're not robots, but we have to be aware of this tendency of policing people's health behaviors. Mm-hmm. Because I would say as someone who lives in a poor city, the issues of environmental toxicity, food deserts, economic, environmental stress, epigenetic trauma, they're all huge, right? And so I work in this public garden, and I could easily see the health protocols people being put on for access to Medicaid, right? Public, subsidized healthcare. You need to do X, Y, and Z things to prove to us that you are taking charge of your wellness, right? Like you need to walk 3 days a week and check in with the QR code on your phone. You need to wear smart shoes. We're going to give you this neat DNA nudge band. Those are, already in place in England. So when you use your food assistance, digital currency, you're only buying things we say that you're allowed to buy. But now we know with like GMO food modification, what if what you're allowed to buy is something that's a GMO product that's supposed to be aligned to your DNA? All of these things are layered in, but then you could live across from the refineries, across from the scrapyard. You could be working 3 jobs. You could have had your gas turned off. And so all of those elements, like that's what we say, they're not interested in actually fixing the problem, because if they did, the market and the data aggregation would go away. So those are sort of my things about the personalized medicine is what is the power dynamic? And like, what is our relation to our food and our environment and our health practice? Because some of it has to have a structural remedy around economic justice, that people actually have meaningful work. They can support their family, that give them some satisfaction, mental satisfaction in their life, that they have access to fresh food and stable housing in which to prepare and consume it, that they have like reasonable support for mental health, that they can have healthy family relationships and heal from past trauma. Like there's all of that, but that's not what the system is set up to do. So I think the idea that you can just have like a DNA encodement and then follow a certain protocol is like the flip side of big pharma in some ways. If we're not dealing with, as a society, these larger structural problems, then I think the wellness community is just going to be a different strand of this problem. Like, and I'm not saying any of it's easy, right? Like, how do we get out of global supply chains? How do we get out of a toxic, environmental stress? I'm not like just blowing it off, but we have to get there. That's where I think if we take an easy way and just say, oh, well, I'm just going to map my microbiome and take a handy dandy nutraceutical, that's like a shortcut that doesn't actually heal the trauma, I think.
Yeah. And I find that it's an interesting perspective that you have, and I can totally see what you're talking about. I think it's also relevant and important to point out who's backing all of this stuff, right? Who's interested in your data, and we'll talk perhaps about food in a minute as well.
I found out that DuPont was in the microbiome space, right?
There you go.
There you go, right? So clearly they know it's important. Like, do we think that DuPont is going to engineer your microbiome to your benefit? Like, I don't know.
Well, again, take a look at the history of all of these companies. You've got your pharmaceutical companies that are backing a lot of this stuff. You've got your chemical companies. You've got the people making GMO foods, your Monsantos, Bayers, like these companies. These are all major backers. And again, just go onto the World Economic Forum website and go and have a look at who their main business partners are, and all of the above. The Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Moderna, all of these companies are right there, including many of the government branches. So your Health Canada, I know one of the Quebec governments, so that's where it all is. And again, I would say that anytime you think that these private companies and governments collude, if you think that the outcomes are going to be good and that they have our interests at heart, I think you need to go back and have a look at that and reevaluate, because we're always
hard. I mean, it's hard for us to think that our government doesn't care about us, or that that powerful people may want us to only live as cartoon characters. It seems almost unimaginable, and that's a lot of grief. I think there's been a lot of manufactured trauma over this past year, that how do we actually reconcile with knowing this so we can move forward? And I will say too, chronic illness, all of the preventative care that was framed leading up to, in the early stages of the pandemic, if you look at the media framing, which is not to say that there weren't disproportionate impacts in certain communities. The question is, how did that happen, right? What is exactly what's going on there? And I don't think that story has fully been told. But chronic illness, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, Those are all being set up as social impact markets for this pay for success finance, for wearable technologies, for the Internet of Bodies, and will disproportionately affect people who have already killed a lot of harm. And especially within the diabetes space, there's research to look at dirty energy and electronics as contributing to pre-diabetic conditions. So that's exactly one of those things. If you're being bathed in EMF radiation and they tell you to put on a smart shirt and walk it off, like what's actually going on there, right? And when you look and realize that it's global finance, it's Sir Ronald Cohen, it's social finance, it's these Swedish bankers that are backing all of this with Stanford Business School. Yeah, it doesn't add up. I mean, it adds up once you understand the power dynamic, but they're not interested in getting you well. Yeah.
Which is all, again, very, very crazy, crazy stuff. You spoke about something called social prescribing. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, a little bit. So again, it's frames is so nice, right? It's like holistic care. We care about you. We care about your whole lifestyle. Right? But really it means like we want to manage your whole lifestyle. So social prescribing is actually a lot of this social impact bonds and pay for success finance came out of the UK. It's a colonial project. Sir Ronald Cohen, who is the father of British venture capital, he's Harvard MBA. He got money from the lottery fund and unclaimed bank accounts to have seed money to start this new program in social impact finance and poverty management, really. So chronic illness was a cost offset. Incarceration was a cost offset. Mental health. In fact, the whole mental health division of the NHS was scaled against this Richard Layer's equation around depression and the economic cost of depression. Everything has an economic cost. So social prescribing is a way of like saying, well, I will write you a prescription for a non-traditional thing, like not a pharmaceutical. I'll write you a prescription. Your doctor might say, well, or not even your doctor, maybe just a care provider, a navigator, they call them, like social work navigators. Volunteering, you seem a little depressed. Maybe if you volunteered a couple days a week, or a couple times a month, you feel better. Or, well, let me prescribe you some nature. That's a big one, nature prescribing.
Wow.
Well, surely we all know that being out in nature is lovely. I mean, if you can, have time and you practice. Yeah, great. Nature bathing. Actually, we had someone come to my garden and they were talking about nature bathing, and I was asking them about this. I'm like, do you know about social prescribing? Do you know about data collection in these environments? If the social prescribing happens in augmented reality and it is in the panopticon, does it count or not count, right?
Weird.
Who does it count for? Because, so we're seeing something called Nature RX, I think. Yeah, and then also Produce RX, which is food prescriptions, prescribing healthy food. But the Nature RX program, that was being partnered with Niantic. So Niantic developed Pokemon Go, the augmented reality overlay of the world with virtual information, virtualized information. Niantic was funded by In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA.
Wow. Okay.
So the Knight Foundation is partnered with Niantic to do all sorts of fun things in your city, right? To tell stories and to interact with QR codes and to unlock information and to unlock healthy lifestyles, like this Park RX program where you could walk with a doc. You could come to a park and you could walk around with a doctor and you could talk about healthcare. But all of that is being woven into these digital profiles, just like you had spoken about at the NHS app, right? And then what happens when the digital profiles also become linked to your mental health? Because part of, if what they're doing is aiming to create an almost unimaginable parallel universe, the people who might resist that need to be framed not as dissidents, but as mentally unstable.
Right.
Right. And so, and also if you're mentally unstable, they can take you in as wards of the state, or they could administer medical procedures to you if you have this label attached. So if all of a sudden they're tracking all of your behaviors and potential like criminalized behavior in an augmented reality world backed financed by the CIA, like if you start to say, I prefer not to live in the Internet of Bio Nano things, like I'd really prefer not to have an avatar and work in a haptic suit. And they'll say, well, this is the new normal. If you're not down with this program and you haven't had all of your, procedures up to date, maybe we think maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe we should have a closer look. let's admit you and see how that goes.
Wow.
And it's really intense, especially if you're thinking that this is not just adults, but this is also children.
Which is just, I mean, it's a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, just to even think like that. But again, I always bring it back to what is going on right now. And I think that's why we're talking today on the show is, to try and like, actually, is there a way that we can see, a few years into the future, a couple of years into the future?
Don't let the CIA into your park.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm trying to do. Let's not let the CIA run our park system.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you, just to kind of expand the conversation a little bit, obviously this is happening around the world, but do you feel, the US CIA, obviously, that's one thing. You've said Canada as well. We've said the UK. Do you feel like what's going to happen in maybe countries that are not as advanced, if you will, maybe like African countries or countries that are maybe a little bit more off the radar? Are those countries just going to be left behind, do you think? Or are they also going to be woven into this digital reality?
Well, I would encourage people, if they have the time. I did a really long presentation interview with my friend Zakia on what's happening with Cardano and the largest global digital identity pilot in Ethiopia. Okay. And they're putting children, students, and teachers on blockchain. So it goes into great detail about Cardano's having its eyes on Africa. It will look differently there because, again, the telecom infrastructure is different, but they're coming up with other systems that are more satellite based and also like last mile systems where you might have a centralized internet access with remote devices that collect information in the field and then that are ported back to a centralized location, and the data is uploaded from there. So it won't be as seamless, but I think in many respects, the goal is to code this virtual world, which hasn't yet been built, right? I keep talking about the augmented reality and the virtual world building, and it's in the process of being built, and there's bits and pieces, but that in the ways in which certain cohorts were meant to build the railroads or build the skyscrapers or like the next thing to be built as this virtual world building. And I think global capital will never plan to pay fair wages on that. So they want to suppress the wages. And so that will be done through unfree labor, whether that's children, dispossessed people, refugees, prisoners. All of those people will be prime targets of doing very piece work. It's not high level coding work. It's like data hygiene, labeling photos, doing that work to code this thing into reality. So UNICEF, which is again part of the United Nations, education is goal number 4. It's all ICT, individual communication technology. So like phone based and VR headset based. UNICEF is doing pilots with virtual reality education all over Africa, in India and Chile.
No way.
And
wow.
Essentially, they've said like kids in Nigeria, they're never getting to school. That there is no money for school for kids in Nigeria or teachers, but we're just going to leapfrog them right in with a virtual reality headset. And one of the programs said that it was originally set up to be gestural coding. So it was post-literacy, essentially. They would just not even teach. It's really this history of slavery is just continuing and colonization. So, and the same with India. And then all of that will be framed as a human capital improvement market. They'll say, look, we're upskilling, the children of Africa and India into this new economy, and isn't this wonderful? And the Goldman Sachs and UBS Bank and whatever they'll make bank on essentially programming these children through the virtual reality headsets while they themselves are programming the virtual world. And it's verticals. It's all about verticals. So. Yeah. They're working on all of us in different ways, and it's quite overwhelming. If you look at it, UNICEF's Innovation Fund, which is backing the VR education programs, their main funder is Disney.
Huh. Wow. It's so bizarre, right? When you start like teasing out the webs and stuff like that. And I just remind me again, while we're talking about that, you've done a lot of like mind mapping type things, right? So like actually laying out like who's connected to who and how deep does it all go. And now I understand that a lot of that stuff was removed. Am I correct? It was
Well, they don't like it when it starts fitting together.
Yeah. So
the program was called littlesis.org. It's like, mapping Big Brother, Little Sis. But the thing is, it's like funded by Open Society, George Soros, and the AFT, the Teachers Better. And they really only wanted to map certain kinds of power. They didn't want to actually map once they got into impact investing and the spatial web and other things. So they deleted all of my maps. A lot of them were saved on the Wayback Machine. And so I still have access to them. And intermittently, I've been, because it's crowdsourced information. So like I have 4 years worth of data in there that I'm finding ways of pulling. But that just shows that the control systems of the tech sector is they can just wipe things at will, right? If they want to.
Yeah. And I mean, we've all seen that. That's happened to me. It's like, email CRM gets hacked and you're down for like 2 months and, you get completely shadow banned on social media. It's happened to so many people that we know. All of a sudden your channel disappears on YouTube, like it's just gone, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually to the point where some people that I know, their website's been taken down by service providers. So by GoDaddy, that's like going way beyond just your Googles and what have you. Like they're just wiping you out at the root level, which is crazy.
Well, and the thing is, like, I would really encourage people who, an important book for framing the context of cloud computing for me and the internet was Yasha Levine wrote a book called Surveillance Valley. That was the military history of the internet, which really, and I think we generally understand it to be that, but the cloud isn't as much as it has lured us in and we can do a lot of, enticing things with it. It's a militarized space. It is a militarized zone and we're not really in control of it. And even within the blockchain space, most of the people who are talking about blockchain or other, I think they're still not dealing with the spatial web and the role that blockchain plays in creating this augmented virtualized world that's also a military world. So, it's worthwhile reading just to understand it within a military context.
Okay, cool. So just before we wrap up, do you see us? And I don't know if this is the correct way to ask this question, but is there a way out of this, or are we just we're just going in and we're going to have to accept it? I mean, a lot of these things that we've spoken about, some of them are happening right now. Some of them are well underway in terms of the planning stages. I think perhaps a full digitized virtual reality space might be a few years down the line. That might be 2030, 2050, somewhere around there, which obviously doesn't bode well for those of us with young children. But right now, like, I feel like we're just at this, I feel like this is a spiritual war in a sense. I've said that a lot. And I feel like this is really about like good versus evil in a sense, in the spiritual context. And I find that, as I speak more about these types of things on the show and speak to people, people are just kind of buckling, they're just getting to that point where it's like, this is absolutely insane. And what am I going to do about it, right? So, people are panicking now about vaccine passports, mandatory vaccines, and that is happening right now. But again, what we've painted is the picture looking 10, 20, 30 years into the future. Is there any recourse, or like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. I think I'd rather frame it as an engagement, not a war, because I think I don't want to be into the military. And I kind of like my word, like sacred and profane. And there's a balance, right? Like things are profoundly out of balance. And that's not to say that we can ever eliminate all of this, but the balance is thrown off. And I feel like it is this point of reckoning on this planet, right? And I think part of what's very hard as someone who comes more from previously like the left background is that the materialist perspective. And I think that the training to really sort of shun people of a more spiritual practice, like in the favor of the materialist aspect, has really hobbled the left in terms of addressing this. Because I think it's not any single faith practice. And I do have people who jump on some of my threads and they have only like their preferred one and everyone else who isn't doing that is wrong. And I'm like, no, I think it is however you connect with like the larger force of the universe, the creator, because it's going to take everything. This is a global program. It's not, I come at things not from the patriot framing. Then I don't think you fight globalization with nationalism, like not once you understand geofencing and haptic robotics. Like it's global solidarity. It's like a global peace movement against artificial intelligence, a global movement that affirms the beauty and complexity of natural life. Like that is what we're engaged in, is a defense of natural life, not just for those living, but those not yet born and all the other beings that aren't even people, right? There are very few people, especially in coming from a place being grounded in a sacred spiritual quality, like whatever that looks like for you, and being respectful of other people and the beauty of all of how life represents around the world, right? And I think that is something people can get on board with, right? Nobody wants to be dominated. Nobody wants to be told what to do. Most people want to be able, like, I fully believe, like, most people aren't fundamentally greedy, horrible people. I think they want their family to be taken care of. They want to live a nice quality of life that is satisfying, and they realize they're caught in something that is fundamentally out of control and harmful, right? And they don't know how to back out of it. So I'm like, if we can access individually something beyond just the limitations of the material world, right? Like if someone said, okay, you have to fight Goldman Sachs on their terms, or DARPA, or the CIA, like we don't have any of those tools in that space. We need to step out of their game as they've defined it and create our other space to affirm what we feel is just and right in the path towards healing and redemption, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed, needs to be healed, these past wrongs. And as much as like the woke culture has been turned into a weapon in this and has made it such that people can't see the bigger picture in many respects, that's not to dismiss those harms, right? Yeah. But the harm has been across many different sectors. So how do we, I think it's a beauty in affirming this peace movement towards natural life. Like, to me, that's a winner. And people follow me. I've been asking for dandelions. I've been taking all over Manhattan, which is where a lot of this is based. The hedge funds and, the technology and the Common Past project on Roosevelt Island. We're going to gather for a celebration of life on Roosevelt Island on the solstice. And we're just going to be like beautiful together and bring that space. So I don't think it's hopeless. I don't think it's supposed to end that way, but I think it is a test. And then the test is, are we fearful, and do we run away? Are we selfish and we're just trying to look out for the smaller thing? Are we willing to, we have the steadfastness to tap into that bigger sacred space and look with a clear eye and refuse and then build something else? Yeah. And that's the reckoning, I think.
I love that. And thank you so much for that. Cause that's, I think it gives people some hope, at least. But, I did a podcast a while ago, actually over a year ago now. And you probably don't know this about me. I don't speak about it all that often, but I essentially lived with First Nations people here in Canada for about 6 years. So I've done a lot of inner work. I've traveled around and lived with Indigenous people. My entry point into getting into natural medicine was actually more through the spiritual domain, if you will. So I've done a lot of that sort of stuff, right, and that sort of work. And I had my teacher. She's still alive. She's still with us. She's doing great. She's leader of the Mohawks here in Canada, right? Her husband sits in the Longhouse. She's a very well-respected, elder. And so I did a lot of work with her and her sort of like core team when I was younger. And so I got her on the podcast when the pandemic first hit, and I said to her, like, what's your take? Like explain what do we think is going on here? And the overarching sort of theme on that podcast was that what this whole situation is highlighting is that we are living in it's highlighting the unsustainability of everything. Whether you want to look at finances, whether you want to look at the environment, social inequities, like whichever one you want to pick, right? This is bringing all of that to the surface for us to examine. But what you and I are talking about here is now we have this fork in the road where do we want to fix the root causes of the problem? Obviously, that's what we want to do. But how do we do it? And what we've just painted out over the last hour and a half in this podcast is that the globalists are essentially using this as their framing. Yeah. Right? But in actual fact, they're not fixing any of the root problems at all. Right. We didn't even talk about food on the podcast here, but again, all the people that are backing the Eat Lancet project and this planetary diet, the diet for planetary and human health, blah blah blah. It's all the people doing the genetic modification, making the chemicals, the Terminator seeds, blah blah blah. It's all so. I love that you're saying that, and I think we're 100% on the same page that, from a spiritual standpoint, I think that we're all being asked to look inwards into ourselves. And I think something you also said, the whole running away side of things, which is a very interesting phenomenon. I watched a video the other day, which is, when is it time to leave? And a guy basically painting all of these milestones and benchmarks, so when is it time to get the hell out of your country before it turns into a dictatorship? But here we find ourselves in the situation where this is a global phenomenon. There isn't anywhere to go. And so we have to, what are we going to do? Right. And I've sat with that.
I don't mean to I think the idea of building community, of reconnecting with practice, with being on land, all of those are beautiful things. I don't mean to dismiss that, but if that exclusively, I don't think exclusively that is a long-term solution, not that those practices aren't part of coming out the other side.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that we need to recognize is that, we, and I've said this for many years, is we have the technology to really move us forward into utopia. We have the technology, a lot of the technology that we've spoken about can actually be used for very, very good things. If you just think about a farmer who has sensors in his soil, kind of like what I was saying with the nutrigenomics and stuff.
They're going to kill the invertebrates. You can't.
Right. So anyway, the point is, if they were able somehow to dial in so that their topsoil was regenerating and the microbial life was nice and diverse, and they were growing super healthy, nutritious plants, and that was the end goal, and everyone was ultra healthy, super nutritious, blah blah. Those are good things. That's not a bad thing. But again, that's not really how the stuff is being used here. And I think that's where we have to kind of look at it all and go, which path are we going to go down?
Are we being a good relative? I mean, I think that's, and again, I'm not trying to co-opt, and that's the thing that's so hard in this, because I feel like communities were targeted for these bad outcomes, I think, in a very systematic way to make it impossible to have this conversation. But I think that we need a better way to relate to the planet outside of global supply chains. Yeah,
and to each other.
And to each other, and to the other beings. Yeah. And what is our responsibility? That's the thing. Once I found out about the nanotech, these people, they admit that they don't even know what the long-term consequences are, and yet they have no problem throwing it into the water cycle, right? And it's sort of profound, but at the same time, once Tom Cowan is so lovely. We actually connected early on in fall, and
nice.
Someone was telling me about the Briar Rose story, the being locked in the castle, in the perpetual sleep, and the princes coming with the hedges around the castle, and always, all the ones getting the knights would all get cut up, trying to get into to save the princess, and and then finally people gave up, and then one day another, knight shows up, and they're like, don't do it. And it never turns out well. They never come back. It's not, and he just said, I'm not afraid. He said, I'm not afraid. And then the hedge opened up, the thorny hedge opened up. And so I think part of what we're being asked to do is to try to advance from a place of love and to not be afraid. As much as it is scary, to actually, if we sink into the fear, that's exactly where they want us, because I've been on that. And I have to say, from just walking this walk, from just being a mom doing education work that nobody was really paying attention to this past year, of risking putting out my address, putting out where I am, telling what I think in a time that's highly polarized. It's been a gift of the people who found me, for whom my message resonates with them, who shared their life stories and their experiences and their resources, and send me dandelion jelly and honey and things that we're trying to use in ceremony. And I'm making it all up. I don't claim to be any expert, and I'm not telling that anyone should automatically believe me or trust me. Be skeptical, find your own way. Hopefully some of this material, if it's new to you, you can look it up and incorporate it into your analysis. I have one analysis because it's based on my path so far, but the reciprocity, even in these virtual worlds over the past year has been quite the gift. And so I could have a much more boring life had this all not happened, but my life is actually a lot richer for it happening,
Yeah. It's all about perspective, right? Perspective and perception. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. I think it's a great note to end on. And I had a great time sitting down and talking with you. I think that we didn't even cover certain things because there's so much more to talk about with all this stuff. No, it's not. Yeah, and it's not bad. I mean, I would encourage people to go and check out your website. So for those of you listening to this or watching, you can just check out the show notes below. I'll speak with you, Alison, as well, just offline. If there's any other resources that you think are really, really important for people to check out, we'll just stack a bunch of them in the show notes and people can go and check them out as they need to. So any final thing you want to say before I let you go? And where can people find you if they want to connect with you? Where's the best place?
Sure. So my blog is called wrenchinthegears.com, wrench like the tool. I have a YouTube channel, which is just Alison McDowell YouTube. And, I will just say, I think the way out is being human and love and care. I think when we get off balance, that's the grounding place. And, I don't think it's supposed to end the way they think it's going to end. I think, as my friend Cliff says, we already won out in the Valley of Love. It's already out there. We might have to walk through the zombie apocalypse to get there, but the Valley of Love, there's like a really good potluck and we just have to do the work. And we have to trust that all these crazy CIA augmented reality things are going to fall apart in the end. But we have to be prepared to actually look at it and not just look the other way.
Yeah, and bingo, I think that is the most important thing. And that's why we're having this conversation. That's why I talk about this stuff, is we cannot just bypass it. We cannot stick our head in the sand and hope it disappears on its own. It's not going to work like that. So awareness and paying attention to what's going on around us, educating ourselves into what is happening, and then making decisions based on that. Ultimately, we empower ourselves as individuals, as family units, as communities, and again, getting rid of the fear and operating from love. Hey, I can get on board with that. All good. All right.
Global peace movement.
Yeah. So thanks so much for coming on the show, Alison. Really enjoyed our talk today. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Brett.
Awesome.